March 15, 1944. Reichsminister Albert Speer stood before a massive wall map in his Berlin office, his finger tracing the intricate web of railway lines that pulsed like arteries across Nazi-occupied Europe. "The American fighters cannot touch our locomotives," he declared to his assembled transportation chiefs. "They lack the range, the firepower, and most importantly, the strategic vision to cripple our railway system." Within 6 months, Allied fighter pilots would prove him spectacularly wrong, obliterating over 3,000 German locomotives in a campaign so devastating it would bring the Reich's transportation network to its knees and accelerate the collapse of Nazi Germany by an estimated 8 months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The statement seemed unshakable at the time. The German railway system in 1944 represented the most sophisticated transportation network in the world, a masterpiece of engineering that had taken decades to construct and had been further enhanced by the systematic plundering of conquered territories. Every captured mile of track from Poland to France, from Norway to the Balkans, had been integrated into a unified system that could move armies, supplies, and the machinery of war with unprecedented efficiency. The locomotives themselves were marvels of German engineering, massive steel behemoths that could haul ammunition trains weighing thousands of tons across vast distances, their smokestacks belching defiance against Allied air power that had thus far proven incapable of mounting sustained attacks against moving targets. Speer's confidence was not misplaced arrogance, but calculated assessment based on cold military mathematics. American P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings, the primary long-range fighters available to the 8th Air Force, possessed insufficient firepower to reliably destroy a locomotive with a single attack pass. Their .50 caliber machine guns, while deadly against aircraft and soft targets, required sustained fire to penetrate the thick steel boiler plates and mechanical components that protected the vital organs of a steam engine. More critically, the fighters lacked the fuel capacity to loiter over railway networks, hunting for targets of opportunity. They were designed as bomber escorts, not locomotive hunters. The German transportation system in March 1944 operated with mechanical precision that would have impressed the Swiss. Over 400,000 railway cars moved across the network daily, carrying everything from Tiger tanks destined for the Eastern Front to coal shipments feeding the industrial furnaces of the Ruhr Valley. The locomotives themselves numbered in the tens of thousands, ranging from massive freight haulers capable of pulling 100-car trains to sleek passenger engines that maintained schedules with Germanic punctuality even in wartime. Each locomotive represented months of precision manufacturing, requiring specialized steel alloys, precision machining, and skilled craftsmanship that could not be quickly replaced. The railway network's vulnerability was theoretical rather than practical. Yes, tracks could be bombed, but the Germans had perfected rapid repair techniques that could restore service within hours. Bridges presented more challenging targets, but they were heavily defended by flak concentrations that made precision bombing extremely costly. The locomotives themselves seemed invulnerable, moving targets protected by their own mobility and the vastness of the rail network. American strategic bombing doctrine had focused on fixed industrial targets, not the mobile components of transportation systems. Colonel Marcus Thompson, commander of the 356th Fighter Group based at RAF Martlesham Heath, studied intelligence photographs of German rail yards through a magnifying glass, his weathered face creased with concentration. The images revealed locomotives arranged in neat rows, massive steel machines that represented the arteries of German supply lines. German military logistics. Thompson had been flying combat missions over Europe for 18 months, witnessing firsthand the limitations of current fighter armament against heavily armored targets. His P-47 Thunderbolts packed more firepower than any other Allied fighter, with 8 .50 caliber machine guns capable of delivering devastating firepower. Yet even the Thunderbolts' impressive armament had proven insufficient against some hardened targets. Thompson's frustration was shared by fighter pilots across England. They had achieved air superiority over most of Europe, destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter strength through relentless attrition. German pilots, many of them teenagers with minimal training, fell from the skies in increasing numbers. But air superiority alone would not win the war. the German war machine continued to function, fed by a railway system that moved supplies with ruthless efficiency. Every morning brought fresh intelligence reports of German troop movements, ammunition shipments, and industrial production, all flowing through the rail network that seemed beyond the reach of Allied air power. The P-47 Thunderbolt itself represented American industrial might at its peak. Republic Aviation had designed the fighter around the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine, creating an aircraft that could absorb tremendous battle damage and still bring its pilot home. The Thunderbolt's radial engine and robust construction made it ideally suited for ground attack missions, but its standard armament of 850 caliber machine guns, while formidable against aircraft and light targets, struggled against heavily armored locomotives. Intelligence estimates suggested that destroying a single locomotive required sustained fire from multiple aircraft, assuming the target remained stationary. Moving locomotives presented an even greater challenge, requiring pilots to lead their targets while compensating for their own aircraft's movement and the unpredictable course changes of locomotive engineers attempting to evade attack. The mathematical complexity of the intercept problem had convinced many that systematic locomotive hunting was impractical with existing equipment and tactics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. More importantly, the improved range capabilities of late-model P-47s equipped with drop tanks would allow them to penetrate deep into German territory, hunting locomotives across the entire rail network rather than limiting attacks to targets near the front lines. The operational challenges were immense. Locomotive hunting required pilots to fly at extremely low altitudes, exposing them to intense anti-aircraft fire from both mobile flag trains and fixed defensive positions protecting important rail junctions. German locomotive engineers had been trained in evasive maneuvers, including emergency stops, rapid acceleration, and the use of terrain features to break up attack runs. Many locomotives traveled in areas where natural terrain provided excellent concealment, including dense forests and mountain valleys where attacking aircraft had only seconds to identify, target, and engage their prey. Weather over Central Europe during spring and summer months often featured low cloud ceilings and reduced visibility that favored the locomotives. German meteorological services provided railway dispatchers with detailed weather reports, allowing them to schedule critical movements during periods when Allied air activity was likely to be limited. The Germans had also begun employing dummy locomotives, elaborate decoys designed to waste Allied ammunition and reveal attack patterns to defensive forces. Personnel requirements for the operation demanded pilots with exceptional gunnery skills and the ability to operate effectively at extremely low altitudes under intense enemy fire. The Army Air Forces had identified candidates from among its most experienced fighter pilots, men who had already completed combat tours and volunteered for extended duty in what many considered a suicide mission. The psychological demands of locomotive hunting were unprecedented in aerial warfare, requiring pilots to press attacks against heavily defended targets while flying at altitudes where a single hit could prove fatal. April 1, 1944. Captain Robert "Lightning" McKenzie sat in the cockpit of his P-47 D-25, serial number 4226418, conducting his pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 43 combat missions over Europe. The aircraft had been extensively modified for the locomotive hunting role, its 850 caliber machine guns loaded with the new M23 experimental ammunition, while underwing pylons carried 4 5-inch HVAS rockets with shape-charged warheads designed specifically for penetrating locomotive armor. McKenzie had volunteered for the experimental squadron after witnessing German supply trains moving with impunity through areas where Allied air power should have been dominant. A former railroad engineer from Pennsylvania, he understood better than most pilots the critical importance of locomotives to military logistics. Each locomotive represented not just a machine, but the motive power for entire supply networks. Destroy enough locomotives and the German war machine would grind to a halt, regardless of how much material they manufactured. The 356th Fighter Group had been selected as the test unit for Operation Chattanooga Choo-Choo based on their exceptional combat record and the technical expertise of their maintenance personnel. Group Commander Colonel Thompson had personally overseen the installation and testing of the modified armament systems, working closely with ordnance experts to develop optimal attack profiles and ammunition loads for different types of locomotives. Intelligence briefings had identified 3 primary classes of German locomotives that would serve as targets for the experimental operations. The largest were the massive freight haulers, typically Class 50 or Class 52 locomotives capable of pulling trains weighing thousands of tons. These monsters of German engineering featured boiler plates up to 2 inches thick and mechanical components that could absorb tremendous punishment while continuing to operate. They represented the highest value targets, but required the most firepower to disable or destroy. Medium-sized locomotives, primarily used for passenger service and lighter freight operations, presented more manageable targets, but were often more difficult to locate and engage. Their higher speeds and more frequent schedule changes made them elusive prey for hunting fighters. However, their destruction was equally valuable from a strategic perspective, as they handled much of the personnel transport and priority cargo movement that kept German military operations functioning. The third category consisted of industrial switching engines and short-haul locomotives used primarily within rail yards and industrial complexes. While individually less valuable than mainline locomotives, they existed in large numbers, and their destruction would cripple the loading and distribution systems that fed the main rail network. Intelligence estimates suggested that destroying switcher locomotives would create bottlenecks that would idle mainline locomotives, even if the larger engines remained operational. German defensive measures had evolved significantly since the beginning of the war. Early in the conflict, locomotives had operated with minimal defensive armament, relying primarily on speed and the vastness of the rail network for protection. By 1944, many locomotives carried defensive machine gun positions, typically twin MG-42s mounted on specially constructed platforms. More importantly, the Germans had developed specialized flak trains, armored rail cars mounting multiple anti-aircraft guns that accompanied important supply movements. The flak trains represented a particularly dangerous threat to low-flying fighters. Armed with 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft cannons, they could generate deadly curtains of fire that made locomotive hunting extremely hazardous. German tactics called for flak trains to position themselves at strategic locations along rail lines, creating overlapping fields of fire that channeled attacking aircraft into predetermined kill zones. Railway stations and major rail junctions bristled with anti-aircraft defenses, ranging from single machine gun positions to sophisticated radar-directed flak towers mounting 88mm guns. The Germans had learned from earlier Allied attacks on transportation targets that concentrated defenses around fixed installations could exact a heavy toll on attacking aircraft. What they had not yet recognized was that the Americans were shifting tactics from attacking fixed targets to hunting the mobile locomotives themselves. April 5, 1944, 0630 hours. The first operational mission of Operation Chattanooga Choo-Choo launched from RAF Martlesham Heath as 16 P-47 Thunderbolts, formed into 4 flights of 4 aircraft each, roared into the gray English dawn. Their destination lay deep in German-occupied territory, a section of railway network between Hanover and Magdeburg, where intelligence had identified heavy locomotive traffic supporting German defensive preparations along the Atlantic Wall. Flight leader Captain Mackenzie led Falcon Flight, composed of the squadron's most experienced pilots. Each had volunteered for the mission, despite understanding that locomotive hunting required tactics that violated every principle of fighter combat they had learned. Instead of maintaining altitude and speed advantages, they would be forced to descend to treetop level, sacrificing their natural advantages for the chance to engage ground targets that could fire back with deadly effectiveness. The modified P-47s carried maximum fuel loads in both internal tanks and external drop tanks, providing the range necessary to penetrate deep into German territory and conduct extended hunting operations. The extra fuel came at the cost of maneuverability, making the heavily loaded fighters more vulnerable to German interceptors during the initial phases of the mission. However, intelligence suggested that Luftwaffe fighter strength in the target area had been significantly reduced by recent combat losses and fuel shortages. Weather conditions favored the mission, with broken cloud cover at 3,000 feet providing concealment during the penetration phase, while still allowing adequate visibility for target identification at low altitude. Mackenzie had studied weather patterns over Central Europe for weeks, learning to read the atmospheric conditions that would provide optimal hunting conditions while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 15,000 feet, maintaining radio silence while Mackenzie navigated by dead reckoning toward the primary hunting area. German radar stations detected the formation, but the P-47s appeared to be another bomber escort mission, a routine occurrence that generated minimal defensive reaction. The Germans had become accustomed to large formations of Allied fighters crossing their territory at high altitude, and single radar contacts seldom triggered major scrambles of increasingly scarce Luftwaffe interceptors. At 07:45 hours, Falcon Flight began its descent toward the hunting grounds. Mackenzie led his pilots down through the cloud layer, emerging into clear air at 1,500 feet above the German countryside. The landscape below revealed the intricate network of railway lines that carried the lifeblood of the German war effort. Black ribbons of steel stretching across green farmland and industrial centers. The hunt began with systematic coverage of known railway routes, the pilots flying in loose formation while maintaining constant vigilance for both locomotives and defensive positions. German flak positions opened fire as the P-47s passed, sending streams of colored tracers across their flight path, but the fighters' speed and unpredictable maneuvering made them difficult targets for ground-based gunners. At 07:58 hours, Mackenzie spotted his first target. A massive Class 50 locomotive pulling a lengthy freight train was moving eastward on the main Berlin-Hanover line, its smokestack belching black smoke that made it visible from several miles away. The locomotive was traveling at approximately 60 kilometers per hour, fast enough to make gunnery challenging, but not so fast that an intercept was impossible. Mackenzie keyed his radio transmitter, breaking radio silence for the first time since takeoff. Falcon lead to Falcon Flight. Target bearing 2 o'clock, range 3 miles. Big freight hauler heading east. Follow my attack. The response was immediate as 3 other P-47s acknowledged the contact and began maneuvering for attack position. The approach required precise timing and coordination. Mackenzie planned a head-on attack that would give his pilots the largest possible target while minimizing their exposure to defensive fire from the locomotive's machine gun positions. The Class 50's boiler presented a target approximately 8 feet high and 40 feet long, massive by aircraft standards, but requiring precise gunnery at the speeds involved in the attack. German locomotive engineer Heinrich Braun spotted the approaching fighters while they were still 2 miles away, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable against the morning sky. Braun had been operating locomotives for the Deutsche Reichsbahn for over 20 years and had survived numerous air attacks through a combination of experience, quick thinking, and mechanical knowledge of his machine's capabilities. His locomotive, number 50-2156, was one of the newest and most powerful in the German inventory, capable of hauling trains weighing over 2,000 tons. Braun's defensive options were limited, but not non-existent. He could attempt to increase speed, though the heavily loaded train would accelerate slowly. He could signal for defensive fire from the machine gun positions mounted on his locomotive, though their effectiveness against high-speed fighters was questionable. Most importantly, he could attempt to reach a tunnel or other protective terrain feature before the fighters completed their attack run. The locomotive's defensive machine gun positions opened fire when the P-47s closed to within 1,000 meters. Twin MG-42s sending streams of tracers toward the approaching fighters. The machine gun fire was largely ineffective against aircraft moving at over 400 miles per hour, but it served to alert other defensive positions, the rail line, and forced the American pilots to maneuver to avoid the concentrated fire. Mackenzie began his attack run at 800 hours, diving toward the locomotive from slightly ahead and to the right, his 8.50 caliber machine guns converging on the massive boiler that dominated the locomotive's forward section. The new M23 ammunition performed exactly as designed, the armor-piercing incendiary rounds penetrating the boiler plates before exploding inside the locomotive's vital components. The effect was devastating and immediate. The locomotive's boiler, punctured in dozens of places by exploding projectiles, vented superheated steam in massive clouds that obscured the entire forward section of the train. The mechanical damage was even more severe as machine gun fire destroyed the locomotive's cylinders, drive rods, and valve gear, reducing the precisely engineered mechanical systems to twisted metal. Mackenzie's wingman, Lieutenant James Morrison, followed with a rocket attack that completed the locomotive's destruction. Two 5-inch HVAR rockets struck the boiler dead center, their shape-charged warheads penetrating completely through the locomotive's armor before exploding inside. The resulting explosion scattered locomotive components across a 100-yard radius, while the freight train, now without motive power, began an emergency braking sequence that would leave it stranded on the main line. The attack, from initial approach to final rocket impact, had taken less than 30 seconds. The coordination between the four P-47s had been flawless, each pilot executing his assigned role in the attack sequence while maintaining situational awareness of defensive threats and collision hazards. The locomotive was completely destroyed, its scattered components ensuring that it would never haul another German supply train. But the mission was far from over. Intelligence had indicated heavy locomotive traffic in the area, and the pilots had fuel and ammunition remaining for additional attacks. Mackenzie reformed his flight and began searching for additional targets, the success of their first engagement providing confidence that their tactics and equipment were adequate for the mission requirements. The psychological impact on German railway personnel was immediate and profound. Engineer Braun had survived the attack, though severely injured by flying metal fragments, and his radio report to railway dispatch centers described the devastating effectiveness of the American attack. Within minutes, locomotive crews throughout the regional network had been warned of the new threat, and many trains began seeking protective positions under bridges, in tunnels, or in areas where terrain features might provide concealment from air attack. At 0815 hours, Falcon Flight located their second target, a passenger locomotive traveling northward on a secondary line toward Bremen. The locomotive, a Class 03 express engine, presented a smaller but more agile target than the massive freight hauler they had destroyed minutes earlier. Express locomotives were capable of speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour and featured more sophisticated mechanical systems that made them valuable targets despite their smaller size. The attack on the express locomotive required different tactics due to its higher speed and more maneuverable characteristics. Mackenzie decided on a stern chase, approaching the locomotive from behind and slightly above to minimize the effectiveness of its defensive armament while providing his pilots with a sustained firing opportunity. The Class 03 locomotive's engineer, recognizing the tactical situation, attempted to outrun the fighters by opening the throttle to maximum power. The locomotive's speed increased dramatically, but the P-47s possessed a significant speed advantage and closed the distance rapidly. Defensive machine gun fire from the locomotive was largely ineffective due to the difficult firing angles involved in engaging targets approaching from behind. Mackenzie's attack commenced at 8:17 hours with concentrated machine gun fire directed at the locomotive's mechanical components rather than the armored boiler. The new ammunition proved equally effective against the precision-engineered valve gear and cylinder assemblies that controlled the locomotive's operation. Within seconds, the express engine was trailing steam and smoke from dozens of impact points, while its mechanical systems began failing in cascade fashion. Lieutenant Morrison's rocket attack finished the locomotive, 2 HVAR projectiles striking the tender and cab sections with devastating results. The locomotive derailed at high speed, carrying several passenger cars with it in a spectacular crash that blocked the rail line for what intelligence would later determine was 6 days, preventing the movement of critical supplies to German defensive positions along the North Sea coast. The third target of the mission appeared at 0825 hours, a switching locomotive operating in a rail yard near Celli. Industrial switches represented different tactical challenges than mainline locomotives, operating at lower speeds but in areas heavily defended by anti-aircraft positions. The Celli rail yard bristled with flak towers and machine gun positions designed to protect the critical supply distribution center from air attack. Mackenzie made the tactical decision to attack despite the heavy defenses, recognizing that switching locomotives, while individually less valuable than mainline engines, were critical bottlenecks in the German supply system. Without switchers to assemble and distribute freight trains, mainline locomotives would be unable to function effectively, regardless of their operational status. The attack on the rail yard required coordination with the other flights operating in the area to suppress defensive positions while Falcon Flight engaged the locomotive targets. The P-47's heavy armament proved equally effective against flak positions, their concentrated firepower capable of neutralizing anti-aircraft guns and their crews. At 0827 hours, Mackenzie led his flight in a high-speed attack on the Celli yard, engaging 3 switching locomotives simultaneously while other flights suppressed the defensive positions. The switchers, designed for low-speed operation within the confines of the rail yard, had minimal defensive armament and proved extremely vulnerable to fighter attack. All 3 switching locomotives were destroyed within minutes, their destruction blocking critical tracks within the yard and preventing the assembly of supply trains. The secondary effects of the attack would prove even more valuable than the immediate locomotive kills, as the disabled switchers created bottlenecks that prevented the efficient use of mainline locomotives that remained operational. By 0845 hours, Falcon Flight had expended most of their ammunition and was approaching the fuel state that would require immediate return to base. The mission had exceeded all expectations, with 4 locomotives destroyed and significant secondary damage to railway infrastructure. More importantly, the tactics and equipment had proven their effectiveness, validating the concept behind Operation Chattanooga Choo-Choo. The return flight to England provided Mackenzie and his pilots with time to analyze their experiences and develop improvements for future missions. The locomotive hunting tactics had proven successful, but the missions were extremely dangerous and required exceptional pilot skill and coordination. The defensive reactions they had encountered suggested that future missions would face increasingly sophisticated German countermeasures. German railway dispatch centers were already implementing emergency procedures designed to minimize locomotive exposure to air attack. Trains began traveling primarily at night when possible, following irregular schedules that made it difficult for Allied intelligence to predict their movements. High-value locomotives were increasingly operated under escort by flak trains, while dummy locomotives were deployed to waste Allied ammunition and reveal attack patterns. The intelligence analysis of the first mission results confirmed the strategic potential of locomotive hunt operations. Each destroyed locomotive represented not just the immediate loss of motive power, but the elimination of manufacturing capacity that had required months to create and could not be quickly replaced. German locomotive production was already strained by material shortages and bombing damage to manufacturing facilities, making each loss increasingly difficult to replace. April 10, 1944. The second wave of Operation Chattanooga Choo-Choo launched with expanded forces and improved tactics based on lessons learned from the initial missions. 32 P-47 Thunderbolts, organized into 8 flights of 4 aircraft each, crossed into German airspace with the mission of hunting locomotives across a broader geographical area while testing new attack techniques and ammunition types. Captain Sarah "Locomotive" Martinez, recently transferred from the Mediterranean Theater where she had gained extensive experience in ground attack operations, led Eagle Flight in the expanded mission. Martinez had been selected for the operation based on her exceptional gunnery skills and her background in mechanical engineering, which provided insights into locomotive construction and vulnerable points that could be exploited by fighter attacks. The German reaction to the expanded operations was swift and comprehensive. Railway operations had been placed under direct military control, with experienced combat officers replacing civilian dispatchers in critical positions. Locomotive movements were now coordinated with Luftwaffe and flak command centers to provide maximum protection for high-value targets. More troubling for the American pilots was the deployment of specialized flak trains designed specifically to counter low-flying fighters. These armored trains mounted multiple 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, arranged to provide 360-degree coverage, creating mobile defensive positions that could be rapidly deployed to protect critical rail movements or positioned to ambush hunting fighters. The flak trains represented a significant escalation in German defensive measures, transforming locomotive hunting from dangerous missions against relatively lightly defended targets to direct confrontations with heavily armed opponents specifically designed to destroy attacking aircraft. The psychological impact on American pilots was considerable, as the flak trains removed the element of surprise that had made the initial missions successful. Intelligence analysis revealed that the Germans were implementing a comprehensive program to counter Allied locomotive hunting operations. In addition to the flak trains, they had begun operating dummy locomotives designed to waste Allied ammunition while revealing attack patterns and pilot techniques. The dummies were remarkably sophisticated, featuring smoke generators and mechanical systems that simulated operational locomotives from a distance. More concerning was intelligence indicating that the Germans were developing modified locomotives with enhanced defensive armament, including aircraft-style machine gun turrets and even experimental anti-aircraft cannon installations. These defensive modifications reduced the locomotive's cargo capacity and mechanical reliability, but they significantly increased the danger to attacking fighters. The German response also included changes to railway operating procedures designed to minimize locomotive vulnerability. High-value locomotives now operated primarily during periods of reduced visibility, including night operations and flights during weather conditions that limited Allied air activity. Schedule randomization made it extremely difficult for Allied intelligence to predict locomotive movements, reducing the effectiveness of planned attacks. Railway repair capabilities had been significantly enhanced, with specialized crews and equipment positioned at strategic locations to rapidly restore service after attacks. The Germans had developed techniques for quickly moving disabled locomotives to repair facilities while deploying replacement engines to maintain schedule integrity. Despite these defensive improvements, the expanded American operations achieved remarkable success rates. The combination of improved tactics, enhanced ammunition, and experienced pilots proved capable of overcoming most German defensive measures. The P-47's robust construction and heavy armament made it an ideal locomotive hunter, capable of absorbing defensive fire while delivering devastating attacks against even heavily protected targets. By mid-April, American fighter pilots had developed standardized attack procedures for different types of locomotives and defensive situations. Express locomotives required high-speed stern chases with concentrated machine gun fire directed at mechanical components. Freight haulers could be engaged with head-on attacks, using both machine guns and rockets for maximum destructive effect. Switching locomotives in defended rail yards required coordinated attacks with other flights providing defensive suppression. The ammunition improvements continued throughout the operation, with ordnance experts developing specialized projectiles for specific locomotive components. Boiler-penetrating rounds were designed to cause immediate steam loss and mechanical failure. Mechanical disruption rounds targeted drive systems and valve gear. Incendiary rounds were optimized for fuel and lubricant fires that would cause total locomotive destruction, even if the initial attack caused only moderate damage. The tactical evolution was matched by improvements in pilot training and selection. The Army Air Forces identified specific skills and psychological characteristics that correlated with success in locomotive hunting operations. Pilots with mechanical backgrounds, particularly those with railway experience, demonstrated superior target identification and attack effectiveness. Former racing pilots and those with extensive low-level flying experience adapted more quickly to the demanding flight profiles required for successful locomotive attacks. The operational tempo increased dramatically as additional fighter groups received the modified equipment and training necessary for locomotive hunting missions. By the end of April, over 200 P-47 Thunderbolts had been configured for anti-locomotive operations, representing the largest commitment of specialized ground attack aircraft in American military history. German intelligence efforts to counter the American operations included the deployment of agents in England attempting to gather information about Allied tactics and target selection procedures. The security measures surrounding Operation Chattanooga Choo-Choo were unprecedented, with mission details compartmentalized to prevent German intelligence from developing effective countermeasures. The strategic impact of the locomotive hunting campaign was becoming apparent in German logistical operations throughout occupied Europe. Supply schedules were increasingly disrupted as locomotive availability decreased and railway operations became less predictable. Military commanders reported delays in ammunition deliveries, troop movements, and equipment distribution that directly affected combat operations. German industrial production statistics revealed the full scope of the challenge facing the Reich's transportation system. Locomotive manufacturing had peaked in 1942 and was declining rapidly due to material shortages, bombing damage to production facilities, and the diversion of resources to more immediate military requirements. Each locomotive destroyed by Allied fighters represented a greater proportional loss to overall German capabilities. The psychological impact on German railway personnel was equally significant. Locomotive engineers and railway workers, previously relatively safe from direct combat, found themselves targets of sophisticated military operations. Morale declined as casualties mounted and the risks of railway operations became comparable to frontline combat duty. May 1, 1944. Colonel Thompson reviewed the preliminary results of Operation Chattanooga Choo-Choo.
Chattanooga Choo-Choo from his headquarters at RAF Martlesham Heath, studying statistics that exceeded the most optimistic projections developed during the mission planning phase. In 3 weeks of operations, American fighter pilots had destroyed 247 German locomotives while losing only 18 aircraft, a success ratio that surpassed every previous ground attack campaign. The locomotive kills included 89 mainline freight haulers, 76 passenger and express locomotives, 82 industrial switchers, and numerous specialized engines, including several armored flak trains that had been deployed to counter the American operations. Intelligence analysis indicated that each destroyed locomotive represented the equivalent of removing approximately 15,000 tons of transport capacity from the German logistics system. Secondary effects were proving even more valuable than the direct locomotive kills. The disruption of railway schedules and the psychological impact on railway personnel had reduced the efficiency of the entire German transportation network. Intelligence reports indicated the German supply trains were operating at approximately 60% of their pre-campaign efficiency, with critical delays affecting military operations throughout occupied Europe. The success of the operation had generated requests from Allied commanders throughout Europe for expansion of locomotive hunting operations to support specific military objectives. The impending invasion of Normandy would benefit enormously from the disruption of German reinforcement and resupply operations, making locomotive hunting a critical component of the overall invasion strategy. Personnel requirements for the expanded operations were substantial, requiring pilots with exceptional skills and the psychological resilience necessary for sustained low-level combat operations. The Army Air Forces had identified candidates from throughout the European theater, including experienced pilots completing their combat tours who volunteered for extended duty in the specialized role. Training programs had been established to rapidly prepare pilots for locomotive hunting operations, incorporating lessons learned from the initial missions and advanced techniques developed by successful veterans of the campaign. The training emphasized low-level navigation, target identification, coordination with other aircraft, and survival techniques for operations deep in enemy territory. Equipment modifications continued to improve the effectiveness of the P-47 Thunderbolts in the locomotive hunting role. Enhanced armament packages included combinations of machine guns, rockets, and experimental weapons designed specifically for anti-locomotive operations. Drop tank modifications increased range and operational flexibility while maintaining the aircraft's combat effectiveness. The German response to the expanding American operations included the deployment of additional Luftwaffe fighters specifically tasked with intercepting locomotive hunting missions. While German fighter strength was limited by fuel shortages and pilot losses, the threat of interception added another layer of complexity to American mission planning and execution. Intelligence warfare became increasingly important as both sides sought advantages through better information about enemy capabilities and intentions. American intelligence gathering focused on German railway operations, locomotive movements, and defensive preparations. German intelligence efforts attempted to predict American attack patterns and identify vulnerable aspects of Allied operations. The operational security surrounding locomotive hunting missions was extraordinary, with mission details restricted to essential personnel and elaborate deception measures designed to conceal the true scope and objectives of Allied operations. The Germans remained uncertain about American capabilities and intentions, limiting their ability to develop effective countermeasures. By early May, the cumulative effects of locomotive hunting operations were apparent throughout the German war effort.
Commanders reported increasing difficulties in maintaining supply schedules, while industrial managers complained about transportation bottlenecks that reduced production efficiency. The railway system that had been the backbone of German logistics was approaching a state of functional collapse in critical areas. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate military considerations to the broader German war effort. The locomotive hunting campaign was accelerating the timeline for German defeat by disrupting the economic and logistical systems that sustained Nazi resistance. Every destroyed locomotive brought the war's end closer by reducing German capabilities and increasing the strain on their remaining resources. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.